Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Hearth of Thought, the podcast for conscious Pan-Africanists. On here, we talk everything African development and how us as young Africans can contribute to the growth of the African continent. So China recently announced that starting May 2026, it would apply a zero tariff policy on imports from Africa. And that includes 53 countries, excluding Eswatini. And at first glance, sounds like a major breakthrough and something to be thrilled about. However, we must understand what's going on behind the headlines and what's actually in for Africa when it comes to such a deal. So, first things first. What are tariffs? Tariffs, simply put, are taxes placed on the imports on goods. So if China is saying, well, zero tariffs on all goods coming from Africa into China, then that would be something that importers and even exporters would be excited about, right? And if tariffs drop to zero, African products by default become cheaper in the Chinese market. So that sounds like a good thing at first glance. And the continent for a very long time has struggled with market access, right? And has struggled with the imbalance of trade, between Africa and the rest of the world. So this is seemingly good news for not only exports, but for demand and for local, producers. So when we look beyond the headlines, what do we see? We must ask a few questions. And the question that pops to my mind is, because trade access alone does not automatically create development. Because think about it, we are interested in the development of Africa, right? We're interested in our economic independence, most importantly. So the real question here is, what will a free tariff policy do for Africa? How does it help us industrialize? How does it help us in our economic growth ventures? Or will it simply make us a champion in export of raw materials? Because right now, if you're thinking trade, you have to think, well, what are you trading? What do you have to offer to the Chinese market? And right now, in terms of exports, Africa exports mostly raw materials. And because there will be an increase in exports, think about it, if there's zero tariffs, therefore, exports would increase from Africa into China, then we need to think about value added. We need to think about, well, how can we gain more revenue? Because we don't trade just to trade. We trade because we're trying to make a gain. We're trying to, grow income. So we're thinking, okay, what does Africa have to offer to China? That should be the first question. And in terms of our exports, right now, we must agree without any ounce of a doubt that we export mostly raw materials. So how beneficial would this be for us to continue to export, raw materials at zero tariffs? Or would it be beneficial for us to export products in a more, value added chain of that production cycle? So instead of exporting raw materials, should we be exporting more semi-finished or finished goods? So these are the questions we must ask ourselves. And the opportunity that has been, raised by this, no tariff policy will really reveal a lot about Africa's development strategy. It would tell us, well, are we willing to continue a long train of exporting our goods in this poor state, or are we going to think about how to export products in a more value-added, style? And we're talking theoretically here. Everything being equal, there's no tariffs on imports. Therefore, there's a higher demand because local Chinese buyers would want to increase their demand, and export volume could increase. That's export from the continent to China. Beneath the zero tariff policy lies a few fine prints that we must explore, and that includes things like production capacity. So when the demand exceeds your supply, are you actually able to meet up with the demand? So that's the production capacity we're talking about. And then 2, we have product quality standards. What is the standard of the product you're exporting? Does it meet international guidelines? Does it meet quality standards? Is it approved by organizations that review quality and assess quality? And then the third part, we have the logistic costs that come into play. How, assuming you're exporting, raw, agricultural products, do you have the logistics that comes into exporting such products for you to get to the market in an ideal state? And then we also have electricity reliability that comes with production. capacity. And then we also have supply consistency. So for your buyers to, or for you to be a loyal supplier, you would have to be a consistent one, meaning that when your producers reach out to you, you can always meet up with the demand. And so we're in this cycle of production capacity, meeting demand, quality product, or the meeting quality standards. So can the products that are or would be offered or will be traded meet these guidelines? Because if it doesn't, then the zero tariff policy would not serve us much, because we wouldn't be able to meet demand, we wouldn't be able to meet the quality standards for imports, and by default we would just end up exporting what we know how to export, or what we can export, which is our raw materials. And what does that do for us in the long term in terms of our economic growth, our industrialization plan, and our development initiatives? Because a zero tariff policy doesn't change what we produce. It only creates a market mechanism or an incentive to export more, but it doesn't create the product for you, right? For you to be able to benefit off of that policy, you have to have the product ready to go to market. And in a continent that exports mostly raw materials, it's easy to just do that. Then start thinking, okay, let's improve our production capacity. Let's figure out the kind of finished products we can export. So the market access would change the price of your product, or it would change the cost of your, trade, but it wouldn't change in terms of the structure. And I mean the economic structure in the sense that, well, we need a product. So there's a product and there's a market. So there's a supplier, there's the product, there's a supplier, there's a buyer. And now the market, which is China, has told you, well, you can import for free. Well, tax free, right? And so it's not a situation where we would have zero barriers to importing to China. It would really mean that safety and quality standards have to be met, certification requirements have to be met, packaging rules have to be met, customs procedures, and shipping logic. Like, there's a whole lot that goes beyond zero tariffs. Because if we're only thinking, okay, well, we can import for tax free, then why doesn't everybody export to China? But no, like, because of the zero tariff, I believe that we would have even stricter rules around imports. Let's take a few examples to illustrate our thought process. A farmer in, say, Kenya, who has access to China, right, through the zero tariff policy, would reliably need, let's say he produces any raw, agricultural product, a cash crop, and he would need, cold storage, he would need certification, and he would need, a few other things. So if that farmer in Kenya has no access to the logistics behind, getting the right certifications, getting the right, logistics for the cold storage, for like the shipping process, his product would never reach the Chinese market, right? And the real constraint is capacity and not tariff. Because even if we weren't having a free trade policy or a free tariff policy, that was never, it is a constraint when it comes to cost, true, but that was never the major hurdle. The major hurdle here has always been, and will continue being, capacity, right? Because our farmers, and I'm assuming here that agricultural, in my illustration, we're talking about agricultural products. How many farmers would you guess in Kenya would have that capacity to meet the demand of the Chinese market? Let's ask ourselves that question before even rejoicing over the fact that the zero tariff. And if there's access to a market, but your production system are not ready, then what does that leave us with? That leaves us with what? Exporting what we have an advantage on right now, which is our raw materials. So let's think about that. And African markets, or at least African exports, is still hugely dominated by raw materials, crude oil, and unprocessed agricultural products. So when a zero tariff policy comes into play, it may sound positive, but it creates a powerful incentive. And that incentive is, are we going to invest in our production capacity, or are we just going to export for free our raw materials? By free, I mean literally just no tax. Who does it benefit? So it may be easier to just gain in the short term, the profit that will come off of exporting raw materials. But in the long run, we're going to reach what economists would usually refer to as a commodity lock-in. By that, we mean we're going to be pigeonholed into, okay, these people can only export raw materials in its raw state. And what does that imply? What does that imply as a consequence for us? We have a few things. Number one, we have low value capture, which pretty much means that we're exporting goods in the lowest value possible. And that's like a trap, because processing and manufacturing, that's what creates jobs, right? And those activities are all happening outside of the continent of Africa. But that's where the value added is. And the second thing is we're going to have limited job creation, because extractive sectors, which is the primary stage of production, would only be as labor intensive as it gets. So the reason why we may not gain from this is because if we're limiting our job creation, which is the second trap. So the first trap is low value, right? We're not adding value to our commodity. Second is no job creation. Why? Because, well, jobs get created at more advanced stages of the production cycle. So we may need huge capital to extract natural resources, but those are not labor intensive. Those are not as labor. They may be now because, things are still being done by manual labor, especially when it comes to extracting certain minerals. But at the end of the day, the third consequence, I think, is the major one, is slow industrial capacity. So the more we extract and export things in the raw state, the less we're going to lean towards industrialization. So if we're getting incentives from all over the place to export more, and what we can only afford to export right now is our raw materials or our lowest value commodities, then we're kind of trapped in this cycle. So let's bear in mind that exports will increase revenue in the short run, but it would not enable transformation. Let's lock that in. Take another example, Ghana, to be one of the world's largest cocoa producers. However, most of the cocoa from Ghana is exported in its raw state, right? And in its raw state. However, the highest value added that will come from, cocoa is not the seeds. It's what the chocolates we all enjoy, and we all, love what Belgian chocolate and all of that, which is produced and sold elsewhere. So if Ghana is leaning towards, earning just a fraction of the revenue that comes from, exporting cocoa in its raw state, what does that mean? It means we've lost jobs in the rest of the cycle of the production, which is where most of the value is being added. And the brand ownership remains external. So we're not even gaining in terms of branding, where, okay, the finished product has any country of origin that belongs to an African country. It's really like, okay, the zero tariff would only increase the demand for cocoa and will only enable cocoa farmers to export their cocoa seeds at, lower or reduced, or in this case, zero tariffs. So without a stronger domestic processing, in this context, Ghana would only be exporting cocoa seeds, and that would be the end of it, right? And we say, well, I'm exporting with zero tariffs. Is that the only incentive we need to be able to export? And volume is one thing, growth is another thing. Exporting at zero cost or a zero tariff policy would not enable growth. So your farmer in Kenya, who in Kenya has a strong agricultural space, your farmer in Kenya would see an opportunity here where, well, I can, export more fruits, more vegetables, more specialty crops. But then if the export demand rises faster than the supply, what happens? Domestic prices will increase, and that will penalize the locals. So we need to think about this deeply, because the long-term solution is not about restricting exports, right? The long-term solution is really higher production capacity. That's really what it's boiling down to. Better agricultural practices, irrigation techniques, cold chain logistics, getting roads, because let's not forget the farm to market can only really be feasible if we have strong road networks. So the transport infrastructure has to be there. So again, and this is just like a couple examples, because if we're really thinking about it critically, for you to be able to enjoy such a policy as a zero tariff incentive, the whole chain must be favorable to you, and not just the end of it where you can export tariff free. And if you want to take another example, in DRC, minerals, which is, where I believe all of this is headed towards. Because I don't think people are really interested in, the products Africa has to offer, because there are no strong products that we have to offer. But what we can offer right now is our natural resources, and they know that our infrastructure right now cannot help to increase production capacity. So technically, the rest of the world is banking on the fact that we've not developed our production capacity, our industry, pretty much. And all we can really do is focus on what we have a competitive advantage, well, absolute advantage over, which is the natural resources. And that's not good for a sustainable development of the African continent. So again, let's take DRC, cobalt, gold, copper. What are those minerals essential for? Your EVs. People love electric vehicles now. They love to be all green, save the planet at what cost. We can talk about Congo and everything that comes into the extraction of those natural resources, but another day. So yeah, today natural resources are exported in the raw form, if any, maybe semi-processed form, but the highest value from those raw materials is the end product. The battery that was produced, or maybe even the EV, the phones, the technology, and wherever else these minerals are used. So, if zero tariff increases the demand of cocoa, cobalt, and all the resources that we currently have, it raises a policy question, which is, should our countries restrict the export of raw materials? And the answer is complex. Processing requires large investments. Processing requires, reliable energy. Processing requires skilled labor. Processing requires, stable policy. And I'm just thinking about it. I'm like, industrialization requires a lot of things that we currently do not have the infrastructure for. So without these restrictions, and even if a country would say, well, we're going to restrict the export of certain, natural resources, we're going to, put incentives for a local content, policy where some of it has to be transformed locally. Even if we were to do that, how much capacity do we have to be able to enjoy a zero tariff policy? Same thing with the AGOA Act, the African Growth Opportunity Act, that's between Africa and the United States. Has that been a favorable trade deal for us? It sounds good. It sounds flashy. You read the policy and it's like, oh yeah, that's interesting. But at the end of the day, the market is not going to create a product for you. The market is waiting for a product. And how do you get that product? How do you meet the demand? How do you do all of that if you don't have any product to offer? If your only product, or if your main product you have to offer is your raw material, then that's not sustainable. That would not enable, a long-term growth. So I like the Chinese example because it reminds me that, and it should remind all of us, that sequencing matters. Because think about it again. You need a product, right? You need a product to go to a market. For that product to happen, you need industry. For industry to be reliable, you need energy. For the energy, you need what? Capital. And the focus of the skilled labor that goes with all of that, the transportation, like the distribution and the logistics. So these things are essential. And when you look at the Chinese economy, it did not become a high-tech economy overnight. It did things step by step, and starting with low cost manufacturing, expanding their infrastructure. They created industrial clusters, and they upgraded that technology over time. It didn't happen overnight. So the key was not market access alone. The key was sequencing, production capacity, industrial policy, and long-term growth. So that brings us back to the central question at hand. What should African countries actually do? That's the billion-dollar question. And of course, we cannot industrialize every single, sector or process just yet. So right now, I believe that the most important strategy would entail targeting specific, sectors and specific value chains, the ones that we feel like we necessarily need to be in control of. And instead of industrializing everything, we should focus on those key, sectors or products that we have that advantage in, or that would benefit us in the long run if we industrialize, starting now for a sustainable future. Because we need, different tax incentives, because we need to industrialize we need industrial zones. I believe that it would work better if we want to, enjoy different export advantages, I think it would be more interesting for us to invest in our productivity first. I think it would be important for us to prioritize agriculture, which entails, irrigations and different agro processes and different state of the art agricultural processes and storage, logistics. So everything that would make our agriculture more profitable in the future and more industrialized should be where our focus and our resources should go towards. And also, I believe we need to coordinate regionally. And by that, I mean, if every single African country, strikes deals separately, and that would, I believe, would weaken our bargaining power, because you're talking giant China trading with one country. And of course, every country has their own policy and has their own trade deals that they're striking. But I'm saying that African countries would benefit from working together and figuring out, regional coordination. Because remember, we have a supply, well, what would be a supply problem, or what would be the ability to meet, demand that maybe one country alone may not be able to meet. Less economically developed countries, how can we improve trade? Because up until now, the trade between Africa and China has been very imbalanced, right? And the zero policy is not inherently good or bad. It's an opportunity. And because opportunities don't automatically translate into, produce or product transformation, because there is a real constraint, which isn't market access, but production capacity, we need to think strategically. We need to think long term. We need to think what's the direction we're trying to head towards. And tariff-free access can increase exports. That's true. But only industrial capacity can improve development, because with development will come value added, will come job creation, and will come capital in the future. Let's ask ourselves, we can export tariff-free to China, but the question would be, export what? Raw materials? Agricultural produce in their raw state without any value added. And the imbalance is very staggering. So China has been on a trade surplus for over a few years, with billions and billions of US dollars worth of exports around the world, and particularly to Africa. And Africa, on the other hand, and I mean every country together, when we look at the cumulative stat, is on a deficit. Why? Because we're importing more than we're exporting. So now, perhaps an effort to balance out trade, China will say, well, we get this free policy where you can import to China for free. But at what expense? What product? Like, can we meet all the demand of the Chinese market and do so in a high quality standard fashion and meet every single, quality requirement? Let's ask ourselves that question, because beyond the headlines, with mineral resources accounting for about maybe 50% of China's imports from low or less economically developed countries, notably Africa, we need to figure out how we can shift from that, because in the long run, does it benefit local production? In the long run, do we attract foreign direct investment because of foreign direct investment seeking tariff advantages? And I'm thinking, in terms of foreign direct investments, people who have the capital would be able to come to Africa just to be able to benefit off of this. So what happens to the actual local companies in Africa, or even individual or farmers or cooperatives, like farming cooperatives? Do we benefit from that? Because it'd be easier for a non-African company operating in Africa to benefit from that, while they may have the capital. We do not have the full technical scope of what this zero tariff policy entails, but what we do know is that when it comes to importing, certain things must be met. So the quality standards, country of origin rules, operational procedures, customs, logistics, and a few other things that do come into play when it comes to exporting. So the end game is not just market access via free or zero tariffs, but the bigger question is, can we meet the demand? Can we do so in the quality that's respected internationally? Can we do so in a way that yields, not only short-term revenue, but long-term sustainable development, job creation? Does that benefit us in any way? And exporting our materials in its raw states, let's agree, would not do that. We cannot confirm the full technical scope of this policy, but I'll leave you with a question. If Africa gains access to global markets, what should come first? More exports, which is, let's just export what we have right now, so raw materials, or more production capacity? Because development is important. Access to market is important. But what's more important is the capacity. Are we able to deliver? Are we able to meet up with the demand? Are we able to, you understand? And if we aren't able to meet the demand in the short term, in the long term, that would make us not reliable suppliers. And, simply put, in the market, if your supplier isn't reliable, what do? You look for another supplier. And we're playing in the big boys territory. So we can't just fumble and just think, well, because they're trying to make trade equitable between a less developed country. Like, really? So I think the headline is important. I think it's important for us to gain awareness of what these things actually entail and the thinking. Because think about it. Most nations, most organizations, most companies are in for profit making. We're not living in a charity here. Things are being done for gain. They're not doing it because they like it. Let's agree, right? So if we're gonna approach this with a economic mindset, the business mindset, we have to understand that our gain is important, not just in the short run, but in the long run. And if we're being told, be by the AGOA Act or by China, that you can import for free, we need to think what that means for us. And so far, we've not been able to build robust manufacturing structures. So what's going to happen? The rest of the world is going to take advantage of that, simply put. And they're not going to be the ones to step in to make sure that you improve on your capacity. No, they're going to step in and see what they can benefit from you being at a lower capacity. Same thing with aid. Aid is going to come in to help you meet you where you're at. Okay, we're going to give you some food. We're going to give you some, some of our resources. But do you really think that is the responsibility of any other person to improve on your capacity so that you can bargain better and get better deals? So I know many people are getting excited, like, oh, I can export to China, tariff free, which is good. Like, many people would benefit from this. And I'm very sure that most of the people who would benefit from this would be non-African companies who are operating in Africa and have the capacity to export to China for free. So let's think about that and rethink our strategies, rethink our development strategies, and rethink what it is that we need and must do. And you may think, well, the government has a lot to play in this in terms of regulations and all whatnot. But if I, as an individual, would like to, benefit from this, maybe create a company, or if, people want to come together as a corporation to create some sort of advantage for themselves to benefit from this zero tariff policy, then we must understand what's beyond the headlines. And so yeah, a lot to unpack there, a lot to grasp. But I hope that we as Africans can be more critical in our thinking and be more long-sighted in our approach. So please drop your comments in the comment section. Let's debate this. Is it a good or a bad thing? I genuinely think it's neither, but it's an opportunity. However, realistically, we do not have the capacity to be able to export value-added products. Let's just be honest about that. So what does that leave us with? Our raw materials. And what happens if we only export them in the raw state and we do not think long-term? What happens when, because most of these resources aren't renewable. So what happens when the resources are depleted and completely plundered? But is it really a plunder if we give it away for cheap? Is it? Who is morally responsible for ensuring the gain? Is it the person you're dealing with or yourself? So let's think about that. Thank you for joining today's episode. That was what we wanted to unpack. Please leave your comments in the comment section below. Let's discuss this thoroughly and all learn from each other. So thank you, and until next time, stay well.